I have the genuine honour and pleasure to introduce to you, for me, one of the gods of radiation protection. It's sort of very tricky. It's someone who needs no introduction. That wasn't supposed to be funny. That was genuine, John. I'm going to read. Okay, I'll read it out loud. John Croft is an honorary fellow of the Society and a former president of SRP. For his entire career, he has worked for the National Radiological Protection Board. Its predecessor, the Radiological Protection Service, and its successor, the Health Protection Agency. He has experience of many aspects of radiation protection, including RPA work, the development of national and international standards, the safety and security of radioactive sources, together with emergency preparedness and response. Of particular relevance to his presentation today, he was heavily involved over several decades with the development, understanding, and practical implementation of ALARA. He has acted as consultant to a number of international organizations, including the European Commission, the World Health Organization, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation. He has led a number of IAEA missions to investigate major radiation accidents in Brazil, El Salvador, Belarus, Israel, and Bolivia. When, in 2003, the NRPB became part of the newly formed HPA, John became the head of emergency response, with the responsibility to develop coherent emergency response arrangements that covered not just radiological incidents, but all public health emergencies, including CBRN attacks, chemical incidents, and infectious diseases outbreaks. He was heavily involved in the response to the London polonium incident in 2006. He retired from HPA in 2007, but continues to be very active in the work of SRP. Ladies and gentlemen, for the 2014 John Dunster Lecture, I'm delighted to give you John Croft.
Thank you.
Good to teach you something.
I have to bring this down slightly. I'm not quite so tall. Okay. Thank you very much, Peter. And thank you to the Society for inviting me to give this lecture, which is a great honour and not one I was anticipating. It's called the John Dunster Lecture, and I worked for about 2 decades off and on with John Dunster, but not in close contact. We were separated by about 4 grades in the organisation, and he was based at Chiltern and I was 200 miles away in Leeds. So our paths didn't cross very often, but it did, crucially for me, in the first couple of years. And this was directly after I'd been piloting a car, and I use the word piloting advisedly, along the top of a dry stone wall until my progress was impeded by a lamppost, and I found out how well seat belts work. And John's connection to this was that he led the investigation team into the accident because it wrote off the car, etc. And it was really interesting, although quite fretful for me, to be on the sharp end of a very, very sharp mind, an incisive mind, but one that was totally fair. And I'm glad to say I managed to get through that examination by John, and I was exonerated from any blame. But without that, I doubt if I would be standing here today. So, only a little contact with John Dunster, but he certainly was a really great radiation protection man. I'm going to read you a little bit from the invitation that I got for this presentation. You're invited to speak on any topic of your choosing, then relating to radiation protection. So that's bird watching out. A title and topic consistent with the theme of the conference would be ideal. And we note that ALARA was at one time a special interest of yours. So no pressure, hence the title. Okay, let's see if we can get this system to work. What I want to talk about is a journey of joining up the dots of what optimization, ALARA, ALARP are all about, and joining up the people involved in that. And I want to take this journey through the phases that you see here, from the mid-70s through to where we are now in the current work streams that we've got, both internationally and within SRP. And I'm going to start, if you like, in the early 70s with the situation in the UK. We had several sets of regulations, and in those regulations, ALARP was quite clearly stated as a requirement of the regulations. However, it was completely ignored in most cases. Most or many people worked to dose limits, and if you went to them and said, well, you ought to be reducing your doses as low as reasonably practical, they would just say, give me a figure to work to. I don't know what you mean by as low as reasonably practicable. And so we start from a position where it really wasn't understood. And ICRP had recognized this in their publication 22 in 1973, and 26 in 77. And they were really focusing on trying to get people to understand what they meant by the orange-colored writing there, economic and social factors taken into account. What did that mean? How did you put it into practice? You could, if you just got two protection options, have a simple tossing of the coin, but that's not really what we wanted. And the focus at that time was on quantitative decision-aiding techniques. They were techniques that were used across industry, across a wide spectrum of events, and the particular decision-aiding techniques that they focused on are here on the screen. Cost-benefit analysis was the main one, but the others were there, and they are still used to this day in various guises. You will certainly see cost-effectiveness analysis wrapped up as qualities, quality-adjusted life years saved within the health sector. Anyway, we were at that stage trying to sort out exactly what we thought ALARP and ALARA meant. And I will use those two terms interchangeably. There are subtle differences, which I'm just not going to go into now. But basically, a lot of the work came through EC-funded projects that brought together NRPB and CEPN from France. And that association lasted many, and still going, many years, and was very productive. Now, at this stage, I perhaps want to thank Jeff Webb for seeing the potential that the people from the sharp end, the practical end of radiation protection, the operational side who were going out, making radiation surveys and giving advice, what they could put into what at this stage was a very theoretical discussion. And he encouraged us and helped us a lot. So the sort of things that we were looking at in those days were mostly cost-benefit analysis. Now, the trouble with cost-benefit analysis is that you have to put a cost on the detriment on the doses that people receive. And you add together the two costs of the protection cost and the detriment cost, and where the two added together form a minimum, that's your optimum solution. Now, the problem was putting a value on radiation detriment. And ICRP introduced a new term or quantity, the man-sievert, the collective dose, to allow this to take place. NRPB did a lot of work in trying to find out, well, how would you value a man-sievert? Do you do it through comparison with statistical, what you spend to save a statistical death in other fields, such as whether you install crash barriers in the middle of a road, or do you do it in human capital terms for how much a person contributes to society and how much you lose if they die? All these were looked at. NRPB did come to some values which are shown there. As time went by, it became clear that you couldn't really just have one value because it really mattered at what level of dose accumulation you were running, whether we were talking about microsieverts per year or many millisieverts per year. And so there was a lot of effort went into this approach and trying to see how it would work. But if you've got that approach, your decision-aiding technique, whether it be CBA or one of the others, where does it fit? It fits somewhere between you recognizing that you've got a radiation protection problem, which is an issue in itself, and something I'll come back to, and the final decision. It doesn't make the final decision. That's down to the organization and the individuals, but you can evaluate the pros and cons. And what we developed, we called the ALARA procedure. And it was a structured approach to, one, defining the problem, identifying the options and factors, etc., trying to quantify them if you could, and how you compared them. But crucially, it involved identifying non-quantifiable factors, so you could take those into consideration. And lo and behold, mostly the decisions were driven by the non-quantifiable factors that you had to somehow evaluate relative to the quantifiable ones. If you look at that structured approach, you can use that for dealing with any problem you like. It doesn't have to be radiation orientated. So we were trying to use a generic approach. Of course, trying to convey what you meant by this structured approach really only comes to life if you've got some examples to show, some case studies. And so, pardon me, a lot of the work at the time was towards carrying out some of these case studies. This cartoon here is from a French one in a uranium mine, where we looked at all the various options of increasing the ventilation, but it's to make the point that it's not just radiation protection you're concerned about, it's other risks. And if you introduce a ventilation system that is going to cause other risks, then you have to take that into account. This is a list of some of the case studies that we did, and I'll come to why we've got a hazy picture of the Vatican in a minute. But the one I was involved in mostly was the design of an industrial electroradiography facility that was essentially an open-topped radiography compound in a big engineering works with a partial sliding roof. It already existed, and what we wanted to explore was, if you use cost-benefit analysis, would you have built it as you did in terms of providing adequate shielding, etc. And we carried out this study, and it was very illuminating. And what it started to pull out of the system was the fact that if you wanted to answer these questions using decision-aiding techniques, you needed an awful lot of data. What was the occupancy factor for the various locations around the radiography facility? What was the profile of the dose rates and doses that people accumulated? Pardon me. And it was a very instructive case study. I got to present it at a big meeting in IEA Vienna, first really big meeting I presented at, and you get to the end and you go, glad I got that over with. And then you see Dan Benenson bearing down on you. Dan Benenson truly was a god of radiation protection, and he starts asking you very serious questions about scattering of X-rays and blah, 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 blah. Eventually, I managed to get through that and convince Dan But then I was accosted, metaphorically and almost physically, I think, by the representative of the Holy See at IEA, who had me backed up against the wall and said, you cannot put a value on human life. Cost-benefit analysis is really not ethical. And fortunately, I didn't think he was going to be amenable to some of the arguments I could put forward. Unfortunately, I was rescued from that, but it was an interesting experience of how you had to take into account all the different stakeholders and viewpoints that you get in radiation protection. Now this slide, it really, there is an existing slide somewhere in the NRPB old system of Tony Hudson standing next to a radiologist in a situation like this. And what we were originally trying to look at was the investment to be made in certain pieces of kit and protection measures, such as the thickness of the lead flaps, etc. What became apparent as we were doing this was that it was a hell of a good training technique that manages to get your message over. Because Tony was standing with an NIS 295 sodium iodide crystal monitor, dose rate monitor, next to the radiologist. And as they moved positions, Tony moved with him, and he was looking at the monitor and seeing it flick over, and in some cases not. And after a while, he was starting to tell the radiographers around the table that they shouldn't stand there, they should stand over here. Now, whether that learning transfer carried on later, we don't know, but it did say to us that, you know, you can do an awful lot with training. Next stage of the process is that our ideas on the ALARA procedure were given the kind of formal approval of ICRP in their publication 55, although they changed the title to optimization procedure, but essentially it was exactly as I'd laid out before. And so we were starting to get a view emerge through the various case studies and the research of an approach to ALARA. Meanwhile, on the legal front, things have been moving in parallel, and ICRP 26, through a very long gestation period, went through the BSS and came out in Ionizing Radiations Regulations 1985. Plus, importantly, the ACOP and the guidance notes. I think that they were absolutely crucial. You've got a rather tatty copy of the Approved Code of Practice Part 1 there, very well thumbed, and behind it, Part 4 on dose limitation, restriction of exposure. And the whole process put much greater emphasis, as ICRP had wanted, on ALARA ALAR. It also, those regulations introduced the RPA, and the RPA became an advocate for ALARA and ALAR and had a very big influence. Also, I would have to say that the regulators were very proactive, and they really also had an influence. Something I'll come back to later, I think the regulators set the tone quite often. Although RPAs obviously help, the regulators also set the tone. And of course, the professional bodies all fed into the development of the ACOP and, and the guidance notes. So very important developments, those. Internally within NRPB, we knew that all this was coming. We've been doing the work on the research projects for the EC, and we felt that we had to put all this, bring it together in what we did under the new regulations, where we were acting as RPAs. And so we spent a lot of time developing what we call the RPA operational file. It was a structured file that dealt with the various aspects of regulatory compliance, and it specifically had a section on ALAR, and every year the RPA had to write something that either made an evaluation of whether or not a LARP was being achieved. Now, this was not just a process for the customer. This was a culture change within our organization, because although we had many people who've been working for many years providing advice on compliance with regulations, it also required them to take make a culture change in terms of how they were presenting a LARP. The next phase of the research project was what we called ALARA tools. And you remember I said, you've got to recognize that you've got a radiation protection problem in the first place. And to do that, we developed a whole series of, would you believe it, structured approaches to identify areas wanting further investigation, checklists, analytical trees, and what they produced was a snapshot of the effectiveness of the RP program, or you could use it for regulatory compliance. And certainly that was done for one large nuclear facility, and it did identify some issues there. That's, if you like, an ongoing operational system, but also you've got major projects, such as, say, the outage of a nuclear power station. And there you needed a predictive ALARA planning approach so that you broke the project down into bite-sized chunks. Those elements could be planned in detail. You'd bring in all the people that had a stake in how the thing was carried out, the stakeholders, and that term comes up later on, to plan and optimize how you were going to do it. And all this helped develop the ALARA culture. And key to that was predicted evolution of doses, and crucially, being able to monitor and apply corrective actions. And it was that latter part that really put a lot of drive into the quest for monitoring systems, personal monitoring systems that gave you quick results, either whether it was an electronic version or it was a TLD system that was read out very quickly. Okay, so we've done a lot of work in the development side. We need to now look at how to disseminate that message. Well, we hadn't just waited to the end. We have been trying to disseminate it over the period of the project through various symposia, congresses, SRP events like this, the postgraduate radiation protection training courses, etc. And to help in this process, we produced a book for the EC called ALARA From Theory Towards Practice. And we recognized that it could be very boring just reading this book because it was designed to be training notes. So we peppered it with cartoons to try and make the points. And those are some of the cartoons that I've used in the earlier slides. So, moving on from there, we're past the research and development phase. We now want to join up the dots with people more and try and get this into training. And we had some initial training events sponsored by the EC at the Joint Research Centre in Isborough. And it would be fair to say that in those two events, the lecturing staff learned just as much from the people on the course as they did from us. And it was a very two-way sort of approach. And there was one, Roger Coates, who was on one of those early courses, and he and a number of other people later became lecturers on the later courses. And they were able to show us some examples of ALARA being put into practice in real situations and provide good feedback experience. From this, we developed a number of shuttle courses. Well, that's what the European term was. Basically, we shuttled around Europe and provided these one-week courses over a number of years. And you can see listed there the various places. I'm going to pick out two. One was Ringhals, which is obviously the top picture. And our course there was, I think in February, certainly it was winter time. Ringals is an isolated place, and we were thinking, what the hell are we going to be doing during the time away from the lectures there? I have to say the Ringals staff put on a really splendid social program, several highlights, one of which was they took us for the course dinner. They specially opened up this facility, and we had our excess intake of cesium from the venison that we consumed. And they said, well, we've got a little bit of music for you. And then they brought out the Ringhals Ladies Band. And these ladies range from 18 to 80, I jest not, in top hat, tails, and fishnet tights. And to say that they had an impact would be an understatement. And what's more, they could really play. It was brilliant music. As I remember, it was Glenn Miller they started off with. And there are many images from that night. One of Tony Hudson leading a conga around the room. Another of, on the coach back of Roger Coates trying to teach all the different nationalities English folk songs. And of course, when we got back, every other nationality had to teach us theirs with an appropriate amount of drink. Okay, the last one of these took place in St. Petersburg, and the ship there is Aurora. Any cheers from the audience? Yes. Okay. There are other ships available, the Belfast. I just put that in for interest because it was where the starting shot for the revolution in early 1917 started. Okay. On we go. Now, throughout all these events, we'd made lots and lots of contacts, and what had started became a network of people. It was informal to begin with. It was sharing best practice, and eventually, in 1996, we managed to persuade EC to provide some funding to make this a formal event. And you can see the objectives there. CEPN in France provided the secretariat and organised things, and were heavily supported by NRPB. So the two sides were running this organisation. But the man who really drove it, Christian Lefort, the gentleman in the foreground there, you can see Roger Cox behind. This is actually from my retirement due. He really was the driver and made it all work, and he's done an awful lot of good in this area. The network is still very active. It has workshops, newsletters, all that you might expect from networks. It's kind of developed sub-networks into different sectors, whether it be norm or industrial radiography. IAEA took the idea and have started to run with it in different regions of the world, and it's been a really successful event. It still continues. There are now 20 countries on the steering committee of the European ALARA network, and if you don't already know about it, I would suggest you follow up on the internet connection given there. Now, one of the things that was coming out of all this was commitment. If you wanted to pursue ALARA and optimization, then it really required the commitment of all involved. The managers, the workforce, the clients of people. Give you an example, we were having trouble getting industrial radiographers to apply appropriate standards on petrochemical sites. So you then think, well, where do they get their money from? They get them from the petrochemical sites. So if you go, go through the safety culture of the petrochemical sites and get them to enforce the messages that you want, then you can get the commitment that you need. RPAs obviously had a significant impact, as did the regulators. Again, I say the regulators set the tone. But what was coming out of this was the attitude of the organisation. Now, at this point, I'm going to change threads, but we'll come back to that in a minute. In publication 60, ICRP specifically included the words likelihood of being exposed into the definition of ALARA, so bringing in probabilistic exposures. Now, we'd always taken that for granted, but this placed a new emphasis on it. And back in the mid to late 80s, I was starting to ask myself, were we learning lessons to prevent accidents? Because I was coming across accidents that we were investigating in a work environment that I'd seen, almost duplicate examples of 10 years earlier. So why weren't we learning the lessons? And part of the problem was we didn't record them very well. They weren't available for other people to access. And so I put forward a proposal that we start an ionizing radiation incident database. It did take it 10 years to get off the ground, but we made that happen in the 1990s. And one of the key problems was lost the word. Anonymous descriptions of accidents. Because if you wanted people to wash their dirty linen in public, they weren't going to do it. But if you could anonymize the situation and provide, say, a one-page description in a format that could be put into training material, then you had something that was very useful. And that's what we did. We wrote specifications, and we did a review of incidents. And I have to say, most of this work was done by Gareth Thomas, and he did a great job, so well done, Gareth. Within that document, again, you'll see me using drawings. They're not so much cartoons now. We'd lost the person who could draw the cartoons, and we had to get commercial artists to do these. But these show the essence of the message you're trying to get across. And I've always felt that we haven't made enough use of this sort of approach to get messages across. So, IRID. The French also had a version of this called RELIA, and I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce what that actually stands for. But these were brought together under the auspices of European ALARA network into something called Uthea. Now, Uthea is not an acronym. Uthea was the goddess of prudence, and that's the name that is used for the database that now combines English, or not English, British and French accidents. It's web-based. You can access it quite easily through the URL that I've given you there. It again is a training resource that's freely available. The but is, if you want it to continue, if you will know of an incident that you'd like other people to learn from, then submit it and get that included. You can write it anonymously. So that's something I'd like to suggest that members of various societies take away and, actively do. Where are we? Yeah, okay, in the right place. Okay, another change of thread, and this is because I'm going to start talking about work with ERPA. And one of the things that we've had to do as societies in the UK is sort out how we're going to interact with ERPA. And the arrangement is that SRP is the UK ERPA Associate Society, and you can only have one. associate society in a country. So there are many other societies, AURPO, RCR, you can see them there, who have interests in radiation protection, some of whom are members of SRP, some who aren't. And so what we set up was SRP International Committee so that we could liaise with our partner societies and ensure that we get adequate cooperation with ERPA across the piece. Christine Edwards from AURPO is the current chair. I'm the secretary, and if you want to know more about it, come and talk to me afterwards. Okay, one of the themes or threads that we'd had in ERPA meetings going back, I think, from one in Vienna in 1996 through Hiroshima and to here in Madrid was stakeholder engagement. And in my original use of stakeholders, I put it in the context of within an organization. And I think that is still valid. But it's blossomed out. It's become the stakeholders in the public around nuclear plants, around hospitals, etc. And if you want to have decisions that are going to be effective and sustainable, then you need to take their views into account. Thus, we have stakeholder engagement. And essentially, Rick Jones from the US at Madrid was chairing a session, and he said, look, we've been talking about this for ages. Let's just get on and do it, and let's have some guidance on how we do it. So, SRP, along with several other European societies, the French, Spanish, and later the Italian, joined together, and we held a series of workshops. And this was led by the late Tony Bandel, and did a tremendous job in bringing together some guidance on stakeholder engagement. And we kept all the partners, all the associate societies of ERPA informed, so that when it came to the next ERPA meeting in Buenos Aires, we were able to put forward a proposal that was adopted by ERPA and became the formal guidance, guiding principles for RP professionals on stakeholder engagement. Well, that is quite an achievement. For those of you involved in international things, you know it takes time to get things through, and I think this really, did very, very well. It's one thing to get the guiding principles there. It's another thing to be able to turn around and say, and yes, we're actually implementing them and we're doing it well. So SRP took the view that it wanted to be able to say that in one form or another at the next meeting, 13 in Glasgow. And so we drew up a work plan that essentially required Tony Bandel and I to put together several papers for that meeting that reviewed the situation in the UK and identified whether we were doing things well, areas where we might improve. And that we did. Unfortunately, Tony by that stage was too ill to go, but I was able to present the papers. One was on the kind of broader UK experience, but I was particularly keen with my background in emergencies, to have one that looked at stakeholder engagement in emergencies, because a lot of the stakeholder engagement happens or should happen before the emergency takes place. So you do not want to be turning up on the day exchanging visiting cards. You need to know about how all the other organizations work, what they can do, what they can't do. You need to have contacts, routes with the public, etc. And I believe the UK has done exceptionally well in that area. Okay, slightly different thread. The Congress title at Glasgow was Living with Radiation, Engaging with Society. And so I don't know who, somebody came up with the idea that we ought to have some kind of practical example of this, engaging with society. How about a schools event where we're engaging with the kids, the pupils at school? Good idea. The only trouble was we let it drift a little bit. And eventually, Chris Englefield, who was then president, came along and did some arm twisting and got me to take charge of a group to try and deliver on this event. And that group were absolutely fabulous. I haven't got time to go through all those involved, but they took what was originally going to be a stall where you met the experts and a small exhibition into something completely different that was a really major event. It had loads and loads of school kids. I'll give you the data in a minute. It had Peter Marsden doing a great lecture in the middle. There were so many people coming, we had to have 2 exhibition sessions, one either side of that lecture. And afterwards, the exhibitors came to me and they said, we really enjoyed it. It was absolutely brilliant because we had all these new kids who were enthusiastic, and it was really good. So we've got well over 1,000 pupils and teachers. We produce some legacy material, which are posters on different subjects. These have now been updated. They are available on the website of SRP and can be used for whatever you want in terms of training or career development. And the ethos of that event was make it enjoyable first and interactive. The science will come through from that. And the sort of response we got from the teachers was, you've got a quote there, it was the best school trip I've ever taken pupils on. Now, there was one important gentleman in the bottom right here, who I think you will all recognize, Colin Partington, and he was our chief of operations on the day. He was the man in charge, because when we'd done the risk assessment, the biggest risk was actually a fisticuffs bout between different schools attending the event. And if you wanted somebody who was used to stopping that sort of thing, I don't know how many people Colin dealt with in the Scouts, but it was thousands. He was the man for the job. As it turned out, his presence alone was enough to make sure that nothing happened. But it was a great event. So good that we decided to do it again and again. So we've done it in Harrogate, and as Peter was showing, we've done it here. We've incorporated it in our strategic plan, and there is a second part of that to establish a schools outreach program, which I'm not going to touch on. Maybe Peter will say something about that later in the whole event. I'm going to change tack again here. Now we're going towards safety culture, RP safety culture. Now this is an actual slide from this equivalent event in Oxford in 2003, something I presented, complete with the NRPB logo turning its toes up because it was about to expire and become HPA. And this is just a slide, and it was clear that we were all talking about RP culture, about commitment, knowledgeable and trained workforce, etc. And the whole presentation looked at the different sectors and the positives and negatives in them. So we were fully involved in RP culture. I went away into emergency response for 4 years and really emerged back at ERPA 12 in Buenos Aires. And I was sitting there in the Associate Societies Forum when Bernard Le Guin from the French Radiation Protection Society made a proposal to launch an initiative, and the formal wording is enhancing, but I'm sure when he said it, it was almost like a new idea among RP professionals worldwide. And that woke me up, and I was thinking, well, I think we've been there. There's something we can build on there. And there was a whole series of meetings around the world. And SRP decided it had to take part because it had a lot to give. But there was a certain, if you like, contest between let's go from a clean sheet ab initio to, well, can we use the stuff we've already developed in lots of big documents like the INSAC documents, etc. And eventually this has evolved. In the UK, we set up a working group led by Rick Hallard and Roger Coates, and that brought together all the UK ideas, and we fed these into the ERPA process, and it was a kind of iterative thing. These were presented at Glasgow, and I think they have had an impact. This one, I'll talk about this one, and I'll come back to the impact in a minute. This is a slide of latent return dose meters. I think Peter was talking a little bit about something like this before. And this is actually, I think, from Peter's work. And it shows the late and not returned dose meters from an establishment or establishments in the UK. If this was a nuclear establishment, I would suggest that there would be banner headlines in most of the newspapers, and the regulators would be camping at the facility, if not shutting it down. But it's not. It's the health sector. It's a different culture. And one of the challenges we've got ahead of us is how to use the various approaches to RP culture and get it better adopted in the different sections that we have, or sectors. So, to try and do this, we've got several threads running. First of all, ERPA either have just or are about to issue on their website their guiding principles for establishing a radiation protection culture. We've accepted within SRP that we need to have this as part of our strategic plan and take this forward. And so you will see it's part of our Goal 7. And one part of that was, first of all, the working groups that we had last time, or the working group that reported to Glasgow, we need to update their work and get it published, if you like, as a baseline, which is what we've done, and Pete Cole did an excellent job in chivying many of us to do the necessary work, and I can report that paper has now been accepted by JSRP, but we haven't got a date for publication yet. We've also decided to set up new working groups on RP culture, and these are, I would call it embryonic stage. You can see the subgroups that we've chosen there. We had a meeting of the International Committee a couple of weeks ago where we developed how we were going to populate these groups, and a plan whereby we would seek volunteers, and I'm looking for volunteers to help in the work of RP culture in these different groups, that we would try and have a UK workshop bringing together all the sectors sometime in the second half or thereabouts of 2015, as discussed over a tandoori meal last night with Richard Wilkins. And the timeline is that we're going to try and produce outputs, papers, for ERPA 14 in Cape Town. So we have a plan of where we want to go, and we want to contribute to the ERPA initiative and to the way we do things in the UK. So, coming almost to the end, I've mentioned a lot recently in this last part of the talk about ERPA, and that is because they've had a quantum change in the profile, or international profile. They've become more of a presence. Their aim is to be the international voice of the RP professional, and there are some new threads that are coming along, like ethics in RP. I'm not going to say anything about that at all, but I do encourage you to come to Roger Coates's presentation on Thursday morning, because he will say something about it there, and to get a view of what ERPA is doing, because it is becoming increasingly more important. For SRP's point, we want to make sure that we develop our relationship with ERPA and how we will collaborate with them, and you've heard some examples of this. Bringing along not just SRP, but our professional bodies and partner societies. And as it says at the bottom, and on the top of the SRP website, we're there to promote the science and art of RP for the public benefit. So what I've tried to do in this presentation is show the evolution, from my perspective anyway, of optimization, ALARA and ALARA, and the various threads that have come out of that, and where we're up to at the moment. And several of those threads will be taken forward in presentations during this meeting. So, the only thing that remains for me to say is continue the journey of joining up the dots and the people, and live long and prosper.